From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
Welcome back. Before the break, Kate was talking about the military's equipment problems, and I would recommend to listeners the editorial on this subject in the Journal today. It's called The U.S. Military's Growing Weakness, and there are a couple of charts there. One that compares the size of the Navy to the Chinese battle force and also the Russian force. And then there's a chart on the Air Force's aging fleet, and I'll just pick a line here. F-22s, average age in years 16, that's the average age, and only 51% are mission capable at the moment. And Joe, these are a little bit alarming statistics, but as we know, to do any replenishment of this, not to mention replenishment of the supplies that are being drawn down and sent to Ukraine to help the Ukrainians in their fight against the Russian invaders, all of that takes funding. It takes money from Congress. It takes a presidential signature on a budget or a spending bill. And it seems like Washington has a lot of other priorities these days, including forgiving hundreds of billions of dollars in student debt. And it seems like it comes down to the old trade-off between guns versus butter, as they say. And there's a lot of interest in Washington in butter and not as much in replenishing these guns.
I mean, I think that this is a really kind of an interesting way of thinking about where Washington is in terms of the way that people are thinking about China right now. Because I think that there is certainly a growing awareness in Congress and in a lot of corners in Washington that China is a competitor now or a strategic rival in a way that perhaps we didn't think about them 20 years ago. Because remember, it's not that we never had a China policy or a policy for managing China. It's just that the assumption was that if we integrated them into the global economy, sort of any of the political or military rivalries would take care of themselves, that China would not reach a point where they would start to pose any kind of strategic threat. And we now discover that that is not true. But we still seem to be living in a lot of ways in a world in which Congress is budgeting as if that were true. And it's worth pointing out that this is not just about this issue of military spending and how you make that kind of trade-off on the spending side of the budget. But I mean, we also need to prepare for a world in which China will not be available as a cheap factory to the world. And so, that raises interesting questions about whether some of the spending policies in terms of the subsidies for consumption that are built into the budget are really sustainable, and also kind of how we think about economic policies for growth in the U.S., how we make sure that you have the right kind of framework in the tax code and the right kind of regulatory system to allow people to do onshore the kind of investment that you need to have an economy that can sustain this kind of military rivalry that we're entering into. So I think that that has to be a part of this conversation, as important as the military versus other spending priorities conversation is. There also needs to be this much bigger issue of what kind of economy does the U.S. need in order to sustain this kind of military effort?
We've talked about the equipment side, but Kate, I know the Pentagon is also having some recruiting issues. What's the story there? Because, of course, you have to have manpower to operate the boats and the planes that we would buy for the Pentagon anyway.
Exactly, Kyle. So the Army came up nearly 20,000 soldiers short for fiscal 22. Basically, the Army is shrinking, and it's shrinking not because we've made a policy choice. There are people in Washington who think we should shrink the size of the Army and spend the money on the Navy and Air Force because they would be more useful in the Pacific. But that's not what we're doing. Instead, it's just shrinking because we cannot recruit enough people to join. And the Army's challenges are especially tough, but the Air Force and Navy are having a hard time too. The Navy came up short 200 officers this year, and the reserve components are all struggling in particular. I think there's a couple different things going on here. Some of them are society trends that are outside the military's control. So only about a quarter of American youth meet the full eligibility requirements, and the main disqualifiers are obesity, drug addiction, criminal history, education. I mean, so these are society-wide trends that are going in the wrong direction and are making the pool of recruits much smaller. But there are some items that are really within the military's control, and I think this should be a once-in-a-generation opportunity to overhaul how we recruit and retain people in the military. Basically, right now, the military just tries to throw cash bonuses at people to sign up or to stay in, and those cash bonuses have not been very effective, but they have been expensive. So I think we need to do some overhaul of For instance, you don't need to run the entire military on 18 to 22-year-olds, mature the force a little bit instead of recruiting new 18-year-olds and then running them out of the Marines, for instance, 4 years later. You could also try to have just different career paths or more flexibility. I think the kind of moving around the country that you often do in the military is pretty anachronistic and discourages people who, for instance, have a spouse that has a career, etc. So I think that is an important element. But more broadly, Kyle, it really goes back to the conversation we were just having about some of the equipment problems. I don't think talented young people with a lot of good prospects in the economy are going to be attracted to a military that seems to be in managed decline. In this editorial today, we talk about how fighter pilots are getting about 10 hours a month of flight time, which is 120 hours a year, well below 200, which is about what the agreed level is that you need to be proficient. And for instance, we've written about submarine maintenance delays that mean that your submarine can be in the yards the entire time that you are assigned to the submarine. I don't think that young Americans will want to join a military. If you sign up to be a pilot and you don't fly, you sign up to learn how to hone your skills at sea, but you're stuck in maintenance yards or you're stuck doing administrative tasks. It's not an attractive career option. So I do think that addressing some of those resource problems is really central to getting the military's recruitment crisis under control.
There's also potentially some cultural issues at work here. And one is that just the prestige of a military career. You think about back, in the 50s or 60s when many people, many communities had members of their communities, families that had military service in their backgrounds. And it's becoming more of a cultural niche, I guess I might say. And Joe, part of that might be that since the end of the Cold War, it's been really easy to tell a story where America is not the good guy on the world stage. And I can't imagine that that would do anything but dissuade young people who might otherwise think about joining the military from going in and signing up and being a part of what America does on the world stage. And so that one is a little harder to get at, although I suppose if we end up with a second Cold War with China, maybe that will change and people will see what China is doing even to its own population and get back a little bit of that moral confidence that America used to have back when we were facing a Soviet adversary. And Joe, I guess we'll give you the last word on this.
Well, I mean, it's definitely true that if you're going to have an all-volunteer military, people need to understand what they are volunteering for. I mean, what are the values that they are volunteering to defend at great personal cost, potentially. And so I think that certainly, this is one of those instances where we've been talking a lot about the need for the administration to more clearly articulate a China policy or a Taiwan policy. But I mean, part of this is that we also need to be a lot clearer about articulating what America stands for in the world. What are the values that we defend when we use our military in different parts of the world? And why is it that young Americans should feel, enthusiastic about signing up to participate in that?
Thank you, Joe and Kate. Thank you all for listening. You can email us at pwpodcast@wsj.com. If you like the show, please hit that subscribe button, and we will be back tomorrow with another edition of Potomac Watch.